highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. Would you like to take a trip with us today? Let's go to Central America. Let's see what life is like and what faith communities are doing in Central America. Don't leave us, because we'd like to have you go with us. I think you'll learn something and experience something today as we visit Central America, as we go to Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua. 3 residents of the Central Texas area are with us, and they're going to share their observation of a trip they took this summer to Central America. Deanna Engber is a student at Lutheran Theological Seminary program in the Southwest. Father Louis Pavlicek is pastor of St. William's Parish in Round Rock. And Carol Harkavy is a therapist here in the Austin community. I want to welcome the 3 of you and say we are glad to have you on Austin Faith Dialogue. Tell us about it. Why, Deanna, would you decide to go to Central America with all the word we have about violence and problems going on there?
Well, I had been involved in some of the peace and justice issues in Austin, and I wanted to be well informed about what was going on in Central America. I met some people who were from Central America and wanted to find out what their life was like there. And I also had an interest in what was needed medically in Central America, because I've worked in the medical community in Austin and have thought about going to Central America and working with some of the people who have medical needs.
You're a seminary student now, but
Right.
Tell us a little bit about your professional background.
For 16 years, I've worked with handicapped children, and for the last 5 have a business in Austin that treats children who are neurologically impaired. And I know that there are a lot of children, because of the war in Central America, who need help and who have a lot of medical needs.
We want to talk a little bit about the violence and the war that is going on in Central America, but we'll come back to that. Father Pavlicek, tell us about your motivation and why you decided to go to Central America.
I guess my interest goes back to the seminary days, and I think at that time I had a desire to be a missionary, and I think in my idealism that's, well, it didn't in fact happen, but the interest was there.
Mm-hmm.
But more recently, I met people in the Round Rock area from those countries,
Mm-hmm.
and so I heard their story, and so that sparked my interest, as well as in the early 1980s with the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero and the death of the 4 church women. That also drew me into the area again of Central America. Kept asking myself, what is going on? Why are people dying for the faith?
Mm-hmm. Do you habla español?
Algunas palabras, sí.
How about you, Deanna? Do you habla español?
Just a little.
Carol, in the intro I mentioned you're a therapist. You're a pediatric therapist, is that correct?
Mm-hmm, that's
Tell us
correct.
a little bit about you and why you would decide to go to Central America, in a place that doesn't really seem like an area where you want to go for a vacation.
No, it wasn't a vacation, that's true. I'm a pediatric physical therapist, and I work with Deanna, and my interest was very much learning about the medical conditions for the children down there. I have studied and worked on a volunteer basis in Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and was real interested in some of the medical situations for the handicapped child in Mexico, and this was just kind of the next step. I also am recently converting to Catholicism, and the church that I go to is quite active in peace and justice issues, even though I personally have not been real active in that. And I really wanted to know what the role of the Catholic Church was in a country or in an area that was so war-torn.
The theme of this trip was widening the lens, and we're using that theme for this program.
Right.
And as we think about the world community and people of faith throughout the world community, we need to have that perspective to widen the lens. And I'm wondering, did that happen for you? Was the lens of your understanding widened? Deanna?
Yes, definitely. I saw so many things that I had kind of tried to visualize what it would be like, but there was more poverty than I could have ever imagined. I saw beautiful countryside, beautiful country, and a beautiful people with a lot of spirit.
Yeah, in that sense, you could say it'd be a lovely place to take a vacation because of the beauty of the countryside.
Definitely.
But the conditions in which the people were living struck you as being abhorrent, ones that you wouldn't want anybody that you love to live in. Is that correct?
Yes, actually spent one night lived with a family in Nicaragua, outside of Managua, and it was a very devastating experience. I think most of us were very shaken by it. Many of us couldn't eat breakfast the next morning. It was very traumatic. It's just hard to believe that people have to live that way.
Father Lewis, you went from Austin to Houston, is that correct? And then
That's
from
correct.
Houston to your first stop on the trip was to
Guatemala City. We spent about 4 days in each country. And in each country, we had a chance to go to the countryside as well to see what it's like in the rural areas. And there were 17 of us in the group, and really under the leadership of the Center for Global Education. And so they have staff people in each country, and they had a schedule for us when we arrived. And so at their leadership, we were able to meet different people from different groups, get a different perspective from those in government and those who might be in different political parties and church people, grassroots organizations and church people,
right.
U.S. Embassy officials, and in El Salvador also we met with the Joint Chief of Staff. So
interesting. What do you call it? The Global Center for?
The Center for Global Education.
Center for Global Education. What group is this?
It's based at Minneapolis, Minnesota at Augsburg College.
Okay, that's a Lutheran college, Augsburg College, but wasn't your contact here a Roman Catholic college?
That's correct. In San Antonio, a political science professor, Larry Hufford, was the, shall we say, the organizer of the group at Incarnate Word College. It was through him that I found out about the travel seminar.
If people who are watching the program on Austin Faith Dialogue, if they would want to be involved in something like widening the lens, that's where they would contact then? They would contact San Antonio, that contact, or write to Minneapolis, to Augsburg College? How would they go about doing that?
I would suggest writing the Center for Global Education in Minneapolis at Augsburg College.
That's the way they would do that. Now, what did you find, Carol, when you went there? What did you see? You're interested in children. What was your reaction? What did you find about the children of Central America?
Every country had a very unique impression, and there were two levels of impressions. Like Deanna mentioned earlier, the countries were incredibly beautiful. And I was, in Guatemala especially, I was struck by the beauty of the people and the beauty of the country. And there's a false peace there when you come in.
Say that again.
A false peace. It's so serene and so peaceful. You think, what a wonderful place to be. And as you start actually meeting with different people and seeing how the living conditions were and really what was happening between the government and the mass population, you saw a whole nother side of each country. And the children were the same way. You know, the children at first were these beautiful, and they are, I mean, they're beautiful little round-faced, you know, rosy-cheeked children. And you keep looking closer and you see a lot of disease, and you see a lot of malnutrition, and you see infant mortality that is 1 out of 5, or in some countries 3 out of 5. And it doesn't need to be as such, but when a country is so poor and the resources go to war, there is not adequate education and health to provide for the masses of the people. And that was devastating to see. I mean, such simple things as sanitation to prevent amoebas, to prevent dehydration, to prevent a little, 3-month-old from dying. That whole process is so foreign to a lot of the indigenous peoples of the country.
You three are people of faith. You have faith communities here in the Austin, Round Rock area where you worship your God. Father, what about your sense of the faith communities
in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. There are Christians there. Some people say everybody must be a communist down there. We read all kinds of strange things that come from there. There are Christians there. They are worshiping there. The church is alive in Central America.
There's a difference between Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua. So I think that even though we, in many cases, see the area as a region, when we begin to visit and talk with people, you see some differences. I would say that the church is in a real conflict. Well, a conservative church in Guatemala, and the Catholic Church, would be more conservative. And there are a good number of other groups as well that have moved in more recently into Guatemala, different sects and fundamentalist type groups.
Into Guatemala?
Into Guatemala.
And these groups have come from where?
Well, it seems to me that for the most part, the funding comes from the U.S. And I suppose as well some of the missionaries come from the U.S. But the bishop there told us that they seem to dilute Christianity a great deal because the Catholic Church, at least the bishops, have taken a stand on some issues, whereas some of these groups that have moved in recently prefer not to. There is more of a sense of separation of church and state. You don't get involved in politics, and so a different view of church and ecclesiology.
May I push you a little bit on that whole issue of the conservatism that you sense in Guatemala as opposed to El Salvador and Nicaragua? Maybe to get farther off the hook here, maybe you two would like to jump in here. Did you sense the same thing, that the Christian community, as evidenced by the Roman Catholic Church, was a little more conservative in Guatemala?
Definitely.
And what does that mean, Deanna? I don't understand. A little more conservative. How would you, and I don't expect you, remember, you're not supposed to be experts on this. We're just looking for your impressions and your feelings on this, and everybody who's watching the program understands that. But we do want to try to facilitate some thought on this and maybe dialogue because of this program. So what does that mean to you when your father talking those words?
I had the sense of a strong repression in Guatemala, and even in the church, the particular bishop that we talked with was an auxiliary bishop in Guatemala, and he himself had been in exile. Many of the priests had been killed, and there was a strong sense all over Guatemala that they just seemed like a very repressed people who were afraid to fight for their own lives. And I think in particular with the church, there was a feeling, at least from the bishop, that they couldn't take too strong a stand. There was one priest that was mentioned and in some of the things that he had done for the poor, and the church referred to him as doing something, it was sort of on his own. He didn't really represent the church. He was a priest, but he really didn't represent the church.
It was as if the church was trying to maintain some sense of credibility and some sense of moderating power within Guatemala, and they rode more of a middle line so as not to antagonize. You know, we really must remember that Guatemala, out of the three countries, is the most repressed, and you could sense that in the people, and the church reflected it.
The poorest also, would you say? Economically the poorest, Guatemala?
No, economic per capita income, it's the highest.
Guatemala is.
Out of the three.
Out of the three we visited, and other countries are higher.
However, I think the illiteracy rate is the highest in Guatemala. I think it's 60% nationwide and 80% in the rural areas. So
that's interesting to me. I'm wondering then, when you hear those kinds of statistics, did you meet people who are the professionals? You met with clergy, I assume, but did you meet with teachers and health care people and those individuals in all three areas? And what are they saying? What are they saying about the changes, the struggle? And there certainly is a struggle going on in Central America. And is there really a caste system between the haves and the have-nots? Deanna, what's your reaction?
Again, it was different in each country, but my feeling was that in Guatemala and El Salvador, there was a strong sense that there were a few people who had a lot of money and most of the people who had very little money. And the landowners were the ones who had a lot of money. The sense that I felt in Nicaragua was that because of the revolution 10 years ago, everyone was poor basically in that country, and there wasn't the hierarchy of the oligarchy versus the poor.
They shared in the poverty, both the government, the rulers. Father?
Well, I think that is the root of the problem in Central America, is the poverty and the injustice, which causes the unrest. And unless that changes, there will always be unrest. And what's sad about the fact, what saddens me is that the United States supports the government of El Salvador and the military of El Salvador with $1.5 million each day for the military to support the government that oppresses its people. That's very sad for me as a U.S. citizen to know that our tax dollars are going to that military that oppresses its people.
Then as people of faith, what did you sense is being done to bring about change? There's change going on, and we've seen the change that came in Nicaragua, and there's going to be change that is going to be going on in the other countries, as there is a change going on in our own country. But what is the change, and is the church as a faith representative speaking for the, is the church helping to bring about that change? What do you, Carol, you're nodding your head. What do you think?
I was actually incredibly impressed by the church in El Salvador. There's a liberation theologist by the name of John Sobrino who we spoke to, and he's a world-renowned liberation theologist, and he made, this may not be the best statement, he made a wonderful statement, I thought. He said, you stick to the theology if it works for the masses. When it no longer works for the poor and the masses, you change the theology. And I saw a spirit, and I saw a conviction with the El Salvadoran people. And the church was just consistent and strong and verbal. They weren't radical, they weren't militant, but they spoke out.
It spoke out how, Carol? The church is consistent, it is there. How do you mean it spoke out? On what issues?
They were, in Guatemala, when we would meet with different clergy, you were wondering what they were trying to say because they never really said it. You know, it was like, okay, he's got a point, I wonder what it is. In El Salvador, they would say, I mean, in the masses that I'd go to, they would talk about stand up for the rights of the poor and carry the cross every day, bear that cross every day.
Would that have to do, Carol, and let's ask Father this question, would that have to do in El Salvador because they had a modern-day martyr like Archbishop Oscar Romero? What was his role, Father, in all of this? Has his martyrdom had an impact upon the church, both Roman Catholic and non-Roman Catholic in El Salvador, do you think?
I would say yes, because in the homes, in the churches, you would see his photograph or his picture, not only in El Salvador, but I think also in Guatemala and in Nicaragua. So he's very much revered by the people, and in a sense, his prophetic voice speaks on today in the church in El Salvador. We met with the basic Christian community in San Salvador.
Say again, you met with whom?
With a small group in a church, basic Christian community.
Okay.
It's very impressed by their deep faith, because their position, their stance was that as a people who are faithful to the gospel, they need to speak out against injustice in a prophetic way, even though it may mean that they will be repressed or killed. And their goal would be to transform society, transform the country, and transform the oppressor, whereas others in El Salvador have chosen to take a stance in opposition to the powers that exist. But some of the church people we met with had this deep faith, in spite of suffering and death, to continue to try to transform their society.
To work for justice, to work for equality, to work for peace, to work for education, to work for those elements of life to enrich life and make it better. The Roman Catholic Church is certainly the dominant expression of God's grace in Central America. But Diana, you are of the Lutheran tradition. What did you find? Is there is a Lutheran tradition in El Salvador, is that correct?
There's a man named Bishop Gomez who is the kind of the living Romero now. He strongly believes in the poor. Unfortunately, he wasn't in San Salvador. He was in the States when we were there. But we heard a lot about him, and he again is he wants peace and he wants justice for the people. There is a lot of fear for his life because of what happened to Romero. There is a fear that some of the popular organizations, we were told that the government did not like popular organizations because they were fronts for the armed opposition. And so many of the people who were working in the popular organizations had been abducted or killed. And so there was a fear for, there is a fear for Bishop Gomez's life. And in fact, in December, the Lutheran Church was bombed in San Salvador. Mm-hmm. Another thing we saw there was some of the resettlement communities. And there is one outside of San Salvador that we visited, and the land was bought by the Lutheran Church, and the people are buying that land from the Lutheran Church. It's a place that has allowed the people a place to live. In all of the countries, because of the fighting going on in the countryside, the people have had to move to the city. They've been more or less scared out of their own homes because they were caught between the crossfire of the military and the armed opposition fighting.
Were you afraid?
I was never afraid directly that I was going to be shot, but I felt very repressed, and in El Salvador especially. I was not afraid in Nicaragua. I felt a feeling of freedom there.
Mm-hmm. Of self-expression, that you could say what you wanted to say, is that correct?
Yes.
What did you find in the church in Nicaragua?
There was a lot of spirit in Nicaragua. In fact, I went to a concert, a folk concert, and the concert was a group of people who were singing about the revolution and who were singing about Jesus Christ. It was a huge, like the Irwin Center, full of people, and everyone was singing about the revolution and about Jesus Christ. And we went to a base Christian community there also.
Father, would you concur with what Deanna said? Did you have a similar feeling in Nicaragua?
The official church, and by that I mean Cardinal Urbano, seems to be very critical of the Sandinista government. But our experience was that the people in the local churches were supportive of the Sandinistas. And, well, it seems to be a split church to some extent. And really, I guess I would be reluctant to say too much more because of just being there for a short time.
In any of the countries you were in, were you afraid? Did you have any fear?
I would say that the greatest fear would have been in El Salvador because of the presence of the military, the patrols on the streets, fully in combat uniform, with their weapons and hand grenades. A group of 8 or 10 on patrol, 10 or 12 feet apart, just walking and watching. And so anything could happen. Suppose that there would be someone who would confront them. I could just imagine that there would be a reaction on their part because they too would be walking and marching in fear. So,
Carol, what would you want to say to people who are watching this program, that the experience, how has it touched your life and maybe changed you as a faith person? What would you say to these people who are watching?
When I went down, I was wondering whether there should be a separation between church and state. I no longer think there should be any separation between church and state. I mean, the church is the people, and the church is the politics, and the church is the society, and you can't segregate it out. And that was profoundly impacted on me. And I think the church needs to be political, there especially. Everywhere, but I saw it strong in El Salvador, and I saw it work there.
You can't divide people up and say this belongs to the state and this belongs to the faith community. Is that what you're saying? That,
and you can't just administer to a person's spiritual needs. I mean, if they're war-torn and they're medically needy and they're starving, you've got to administer to all of that as a
I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. Those words mean something to you.
They do now, much more than they did before. And in my field of working with handicapped children, I really felt like that's all I need to pay attention to. And I no longer believe that I can close my eyes.
Aha. Your lens had been widened, huh? That's great.
And it was frustrating. It was like, I deal enough with this every day. I don't, and it's, no, I have a responsibility to know what else goes on. And I have a real different attitude when I see people in need in different areas. I feel like I need to be open to that.
Well, I want to thank the three of you. You've taken us on a very interesting and fascinating look at Central America and those three countries in particular. And thanks be to God for those people of faith who are there. Our three guests returned with many feelings and thoughts within themselves. And they asked if I would share these words in closing that are going to appear on your television screen. And I'd invite you, words written by a person who traveled into Mexico and wrote these words, and now they share them. Please watch your screen as I read. We are back now, all of us, newly born again to life, to struggle and to pain we never knew before, led into life by those who live daily with death, fed by the hungry who took our white hands, uncalloused, into theirs, dry and gnarled and brown. They took us in, the strangers, into barren huts with shy smiles. They shared their sparse lives. Don't, we beg you, ask us if we had a good time. It was painful, stabbing. The ache will burn within us, haunting our safe American dreams. For they, the lost of the earth, have found us, moved us to reality, and in the finding, perhaps, just perhaps, have saved us. Deanna, Father, Carol, thank you for being on Austin Faith Dialogue. And thanks to all of you. Shalom.